Should you buy an investment property with tenants that aren't paying rent? Let's get into it right now.
What's going on, everybody? My name is Andrew and today I'm here with Costas and we want to talk to you about real estate investing and if you as an investor should pick up a rental property where the tenants are currently not paying rent. Now this question came up because we actually got an email from a landlord in Welland, Ontario, and he's asking the question, should I buy a property that has tenants that have been paying rent for the last 4 months collectively, and it is a triplex that he's looking to pick up? Now that is actually a very good question. It's a tricky question because today when limited inventory, we're looking at a variety of options that we may have never considered before, because I think a lot of the, like just a year ago, if we're looking at properties to pick up, we're talking about, we wouldn't consider problems like this, and if we are, it has to be seriously undervalued. But now even properties with tenants who aren't paying rent, there's people who are buying these places and are willing to take on those challenges, and that is crazy. So what we want to do is we want to actually talk about one of our own experiences. If you remember, Costas, we picked up that one property and it had tenants that weren't paying rent for about 6 months. Now just to clarify, this was a little pre-pandemic. However, a lot of the same rules still apply, and if we are going to take the pandemic into context, we're just going to have to elongate this process a little bit. But let's talk about that so we can address this. So Costas, you remember that property that we were looking into, and they had those tenants that were not paying rent, and they were something like 4 months in by the time we looked at it and looking to buy it. Why don't you recap that story for us a little bit?
Well, I'll tell you right now, that's a situation that I won't forget because I think it's one of the most difficult situations that me and Andrew actually tackled. And guys, we have tackled some tricky situations. You know, long story short, we get into this property. We're looking at tenants that are not paying rent. They're about 4 months behind, like Andrew had mentioned, but the property was priced at a very good price. So it was priced to sell and we wanted to acquire it. Needed a little bit of work, but definitely if we breathed some life into it, it would have been something that would have sold for a good, nice, tidy profit.
Yeah, you see, one of the things that you have to consider when you're looking at something like this is that the property will have to be undervalued at least a little bit, and there are certain costs that you're going to have to take into consideration, such as, obviously, when we're picking up that property, we didn't account to take in any rents for the period of time that the tenant would be paying rent, and we considered maybe 6 months now that we're looking at a possibility for the eviction process, and that all depends on everything working out nicely. So we have to make sure that we're balancing our budget accordingly when we're trying to do something like this. So why don't we talk about the actual eviction process? So because when we went in, I think we found out that the previous landlord didn't even file the legal forms correctly because even simple things like the N4, the dates weren't done correctly. By the time they received them, they didn't leave the extra days you need for the mailing time, because if any of you don't know, when you're serving an N4, if you're mailing it by mail, you have to allow for this extra days so that the tenant can then receive it if you're dropping in the mail, unless you're serving it in person. But in this case, it was very easy for the tenants to just take this to the tribunal and get it kicked out because it wasn't filed correctly, and that sets us back. So Costas, you had to start the whole process from scratch again. So now 6 months in, and you're now in. So what happened?
So what I did was I filed the N4 and made sure that they receive it and waited the allotted time to file the L1. And once we filed the L1, we just waited for a hearing date. But the problem with that is it could take a long time. And I know you remember that. We waited a couple of months to get that hearing date.
Yeah, that was a little bit painful. And did they show up? I can't remember.
You know what, Andrew? They didn't even show up.
Okay, yeah, that's right. They didn't show up, and we were worried that they were going to then make a motion with the LTB that they didn't receive their hearing documents. Because that's also one thing that a lot of tenants do, is that they will just skip their first hearing date and then say, oh, I wasn't able to attend for some whatever circumstances. And the disposition of the LTB is to give them a chance. You always want to be able to give them a chance. And these are good systems that are generally in place, except when you're dealing with people who are in a position to abuse them. Because they didn't even say that they missed it. They just didn't care.
They just didn't care. They didn't show up. And the part that actually really threw me off, Andrew, was that the adjudicator was willing to give them enough time past the time that the hearing was scheduled.
Oh yeah, and they didn't even show up.
Did you remember that?
Yeah, they didn't even show up, and the adjudicator was defending their position on their behalf.
And that is the difficult situation, because not only are you combating the tenant that has not paid you rent for X amount of months, but you're now also in contention with the adjudicator, all in the same time.
Yeah.
Right?
Now,
So
are they supposed to do that? Because like an adjudicator, I think they're supposed to be relatively unbiased, but I did think that was an unusual situation, that even though the tenant wasn't there, she was reluctant to give an order to evict, right?
yeah.
Right, and so I don't know, was that normal? Because you've obviously gone to several hearings and seen a few things, so is that normal?
When you're looking at a tenant that has not paid rent for X amount of months, we're not talking 1-2 months, we're talking 3, 4, 5 plus. It's very unusual for the adjudicator to look at that and say, okay, well, you know what, they're behind about 1 or 2 months. There's a degree of leniency here, right?
Yeah.
But to have the adjudicator, challenge you as to whether or not they want to provide that, that order to evict, that is definitely an unusual circumstance, for sure.
No, exactly, and that's what really threw us a bit of a curveball, because when we're looking at rental properties that have tenants who aren't paying, we want to be able to rely on a degree of due process, right? And even if we want to bypass that, we always calculate into our budget, whatever money that we're going to spend going through the tribunal, going through the LTB, like you're going to calculate legal fees, you're going to calculate losses of rent, eviction time, eviction fees, damage to the properties, you're going to add all that stuff up. And then you're going to say, well, instead of putting this money towards the legal process, why not offer this money to the tenant? So I know you even did offer them money, but what happened with that?
It's really hard when the tenants are not communicating with you. So the lack of communication there was a major barrier for us, because obviously, we're sympathetic to the situation. We know that people go through things, and we want to be able to deal with things appropriately and amicably. That's always the best, direction and course of action that you want to take when dealing with tenants that maybe are not cooperating with you. But with these particular tenants, it was really, really difficult, because there were the channels of communication were non-existent at that point. So.
Yeah. They were just ignoring you.
Just blatantly ignoring me. Yeah. After like the third month, it was just like I couldn't get them on the line. We actually showed up to their house. No one was answering the door. So
were they home?
Oh yeah, and it was a very complex situation, Andrew. Yeah. One of the hardest I've dealt with, actually, but. You're gonna go through these as real estate investors, guys. So.
Yeah, no, exactly. And I remember the thing that was stressing me out the most was that there was a backup in the plumbing. And what happened was their furnace was in a crawl space, and what was happening was the sewage was backing up, and then they wouldn't even let our guys go in there for a repair. So the basement was just becoming a giant septic tank. This is like insane amounts of damages. And this is why this is one of the worst ones that we found, because usually people will at least respond to a certain amount of money, right? Like when it comes to, can you make a move? But in this case, they didn't even we didn't even pay them money, right? They didn't take money.
No.
Okay, so remember, so we got an eviction order, and then what happened with the eviction order?
So we were granted the eviction order, which was great after like...
On that first hearing,
yeah,
they didn't show up.
For sure.
Thankfully we got it,
Yeah, 100%. And then they just left. We got I don't even think we got the sheriff involved at that point. I think they just left, right?
They just left. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So
which is good.
Left. And then we went into the property and found it destroyed. Now, but okay. So we've illustrated that this is obviously it can be a gong show of a process, right? But is it worth it for somebody to buy this? That was like the worst case scenario. But like, how would you relate this to the other situations where oftentimes we'll pick up a property with tenants who might not be paying rent? Because that was a worst case scenario. Now, what is an average case scenario?
Usually when you're looking at a property that's well under market value and it's worth the investment, you should budget a portion of your investment to be able to work with the tenants. And when I say that, what I mean is maybe taking the cash for keys route, seeing if their issues are maybe financial, maybe they can't pay, maybe they've fallen on hard times and you need to work with them. So what I do is sometimes I set a portion of my investment funds, right, in situations like this, to work with the tenants and see if I can help them kind of expedite the circumstance.
Because that's the thing that sometimes people don't consider, is that when we're looking at doing real estate as a business and we're looking at doing flips, it's like flipping a property or burying it or something like that. It's not always a renovation flip, right? You can actually flip the rents, right? And if you can actually offer a win-win situation to both parties, there is something to be done here, as long as you're budgeting for it, right? Because people don't want to be living in hard situations, right? So a lot of the times when we approach these, when we'll approach different people who are falling behind on rents, or like they have other things happening, who knows? They might have bills that are just piling onto them. If you can come with a buyout of $10,000 and they're willing to accept it, yeah, why wouldn't you do it? And if you have 3 tenants, you need to offer them $10,000, maybe even $15,000. I mean, how much would a renovation cost you? $40,000? For one renovation, you buy out all the tenancies, they're happy, you're happy, and you have a clean product to work with, right? It saves you time, it saves you money in the long run, and you can flip those properties for a profit. Like, how much did we make, even with that worst case scenario, how much did we end up selling that for after we renovated it?
Oh, we did very well. I think it was like north of 600,000.
Yeah. So I think
we did very well.
After all things were considered, I think there was a profit margin of like 70 grand, right? So I mean, all things considered, like this did take, I think, from when we purchased it, I think like 6 to 8 months to close.
Yeah, that's roughly the time.
Yeah, so the renovation part was really quick. It was the waiting for the tenants to actually leave, right? So this was a bit of a messy process. But anyway, long story short, you can definitely make a pretty profit if you work with properties that do have tenants who aren't paying rent. You have to remember that the desirability of those properties is not going to be as high, because obviously real estate investors who are not expecting to make those grandiose returns are going to look at a property like this and say, I don't want the headache. But if you're willing to do a little bit, if you're willing to put in a little hustle into these properties, you can definitely make yourself some money. So you think that covers it?
I think that covers it.
All right. So if you guys want to know more about real estate investing or how to approach the matters through the LTB, make sure to tune in with us with our next episode, and we'll see you on the next one. Like this video, subscribe to our channel.